Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming back. I hope none of you have sharp implements, especially those of you sitting in the front. I noticed about at least a third, maybe 40% of your classmates decided that, I guess they were going to drop the class since they're not here. Okay. So I hope you found Tuesday's experience not terribly depressing. But it is what it is, and it's behind us, and the GSIs are busily grading away. So as soon as all of the GSIs have finished grading, we'll look at the various and sundry scores across GSI sections, and I'll talk more about grades at that point. Today, though, we want to start not just the second third of the class, but actually the final two-thirds of the course. So up to this point, we've had three different models: production function, saving and investment, and our solo growth model. Going forward, just for your entertainment value, we actually only have one model. Now, it turns out it's a bit more complicated, and there are various pieces to it, but we're basically only going to be using one more model for the balance of the semester, and there will be a lot of nuances associated with this model types of nuances that we did not consider earlier. To think about what we're going to do, though, remember that our solo growth model was basically telling us, on average, what will an economy's annual growth rate will be over some long period of time, 10 years, 20 years, so forth. But it's the average annual growth rate that it's generating. And we saw that depends upon total factor productivity, labor force growth, savings rates, depreciation rates, things of that nature. In our growth accounting formula, we can see exactly the same thing. How fast the economy would grow on average over long periods of time depends upon how fast the factors of production, capital and labor grow, as well as total factor productivity. In our saving and investment model, we saw how the decisions on saving, which derive from consumer spending, income, taxes, government spending, and investment actually help to determine what the real interest rate is going to be. Again, on average over a longer period of time. And differences between saving and investment would also tell us whether a country had a net export surplus or a net export deficit. None of those models that we've looked at really tell us very much about how the recession that started in 2008 and went into the middle of 2009 began, or what the government did in response to that recession and what effects that would have. Nor does it tell us anything about what things the government maybe should have done, or what would have been the results had the government done something differently. So when we think about how the economy performs over shorter periods of time, a year or two or three, maybe stretching it to 4 or 5, we actually need a different model than what we've looked at so far. And so that's what we're going to be building over the next several weeks, is a model that is going to be used primarily to talk about what we refer to as short-run business fluctuations. Now, your author of the textbook refers to these as business cycles. I don't like that terminology because cycles has this tendency to imply something that is very regular and uniform. And business fluctuations are neither regular nor uniform. So in most cases, I'm going to refer to this as business fluctuations unless I slip into a bad habit and call it a business cycle. So what we need to think about then is some of the terminology that we use. First of which, what do we even mean by business fluctuations or business cycles? So if the solo model gives us our average annual growth rate over some long period of time, then our business fluctuations are simply going to be the movement of actual GDP around that longer-term average. So the ups and downs of real economic activity versus that long-term average. So one way to think about that is let's put business activity on the vertical axis. Right? We can measure business activity by real GDP. And we're simply going to put a time frame on the horizontal axis. So whatever time period we want to look at. The solo model showed us, especially if there is ongoing growth in total factor productivity, that our average annual growth rate will be positive. So we could think about the economy growing on average along this line, which we will refer to as potential or full employment output. Now remember, in our production function model, what we referred to as potential or full employment output was where the labor market was in equilibrium. Right? So the solo model basically incorporates that phenomenon. So every steady state, as it's moving out, as total factor productivity is growing, is also telling us what's happening to potential output. So that's all that we've shown here. Now, we also have what the economy actually does from year to year. And that might look something like this, where this red line is now actual real GDP. And as you can see, there are some periods of time when we're above our long-term potential. There are times when we're below. There are times when we might be well above potential. And there may be times where we're stuck below potential. So lots of different things can happen. And what we need then is a model that's going to help us to explain the red line, the solo model, the growth accounting formula, the production function, saving and investment. They help us with the black line, potential output. But they don't help us with the red line, actual output. So we want to find a model then, or some sort of explanatory mechanism for thinking about what generates the movements in this actual level of economic output. Now, when we think about business fluctuations, we can actually take that movement around that long-term trend and break it into 4 components, what we call the peak, the recession, the trough, and the expansion. So each of those has a particular definition. The peak, pretty obvious, right? It's the maximum level that economic activity reaches before it begins to turn down. Notice you would only know that after the fact. Right? In an economy that's growing, you can't know you're at a peak until actually it has started to turn down. So it'll be sometime after the peak has been reached when you will actually know it. When the economy is actually shrinking, getting smaller, we refer to that as the contraction, or more popularly, the recession, the period of time when the economy is contracting. Now, a depression is nothing more than a very severe and prolonged recession. So one way of thinking about that is we actually have a pretty precise definition of what a recession is. We do not have a precise definition of what a depression is. And the reason for that is historically, depressions were very unusual and rare events. The fact that Southern Europe has been in a depression for the better part of 5, 6, 7 years, depending upon which country you're looking at, maybe we need to start thinking about a more formal definition for what depression means. Now, you may also know that during the 1930s, the United States experienced something that we now call the Great Depression. Right? So during that Great Depression, roughly 1929 to 1941, we saw the unemployment rate shoot up from 4% to roughly 24%. It then came down to about 12% by 1937, then jumped back up to 19% in 1938, and then started to come down again, and it didn't really come below 10% until the United States entered World War II in 1942. So It wasn't that the economy was shrinking during that entire period of time. It was that the unemployment rate was really high for that entire period of time. Just like what we see in Southern Europe now, where you have unemployment rates in the 20 to 30% range in countries like Greece or Spain or Portugal or Ireland. I realize Ireland's not a Southern European country. But these are the crisis countries where the unemployment rates are very high. And they've been very high for a long period of time. So we would clearly want to classify that experience as a depression. Now, the third feature of a business cycle or business fluctuation is something known as the trough. This is the bottom point that economic activity falls to, right? The very bottom, before the economy starts to expand again. And the expansion is basically from the trough back up to the next peak level. So we end up then with a peak, a recession, a trough, and an expansion. Now, when the expansion gets very bubbly, sort of we're above potential output, the economy is still growing strong, things are feeling really, really good, we often refer to that as a boom, right? An economic boom. So that's our typical kind of nomenclature for a business fluctuation. There's one other definition, though, that we should throw in here, and that is something that is known as a growth recession. And yes, I'm perfectly aware that growth recession is actually an oxymoron. You may recall that an oxymoron is using two words that have opposite meanings, sort of like jumbo shrimp, right? Growth means the economy is growing. Recession means it's contracting. How can we use growth recession as an expression? So what we mean by a growth recession is, yes, the economy is indeed growing. We have positive growth rates. But those growth rates are very, very slow. They are so slow that the unemployment rate is still rising. So as the economy grows, the demand for labor will also grow, but the demand for labor will be growing more slowly than the supply of labor. So consequently, the unemployment rate will continue to rise. So we'll come back and look at a couple of periods of time where we had growth recessions in the United States. So here's a diagram of real GDP. Now this goes back to 1979 through 1983. Remember, the gray shaded areas, the bars there, are periods that are officially defined as recessions. So when we look at this, the level of GDP, we can see right here we reached a peak. We know that was a peak because right after that, the economy was smaller. And eventually, over here, we reached a trough. So we've got our peaks and our troughs. Right after the trough, the economy started to expand again. So this period in here is our recession. And then if we look forward, we can see, well, here's another peak. So this period in here is the economic expansion. Now notice one thing. Even during this expansion, there was one period where the economy actually shrank, but only for a very short period of time before it started to grow and it moved back to a higher level. So we're not calling a recession in here. So very short-term dips in economic activity are not referred to as recessions. Right? So every now and then you can have a negative quarter of GDP growth. Now way over here is another trough. Again, you might see that right here, the economy actually grew. So in the middle of this recession in 1981 and 1982, in the middle of that recession, we actually had a positive quarter of GDP growth. But it was just a one-quarter increase, and then the economy sagged again. So we would not want to say the recession's over. And then, by the way, the recession started again 3 months later. Right? So we're looking at a longer period of time. And then, of course, you can see the expansion began in earnest in 1973. So this gives us then an idea of the various phases of a business cycle or a business fluctuation. This is the same data, except it's on a growth rate term. So here you can see where that economy grew, even though we were still in the middle of a recession. And here you can see where the economy shrank, even though we were in the middle of an economic expansion. Here's a more stylized version of what we have just been talking about, right? So here's potential output, our black line. Our blue line is actual. Peak, where we reach the peak. Trough at the bottom, up to the next peak. You can easily see the contraction or recession and the expansion beyond that. But this particular diagram also shows one more thing, and that is the difference between actual and potential output, something we refer to as the output gap, And we measure the output gap in percentage terms. Potential output is rising over time. So to talk about it in dollar terms doesn't make sense to make comparisons across different time periods. We want to have some way of saying how far was the economy away from its potential. Right? In a percentage terms will give us a much better way of looking at that. So here I actually charted the output gap. I should have converted it to absolute percentages, but I just put it as 100% would be being at potential. Right? So the red line here then just tells us when we would be at potential. The first thing to notice about this, we're almost never at potential. Right? We're above it, we're below it, but we're rarely at potential for any period of time. In fact, most of the time when we're at potential, it's because the output gap is rising and we're passing through it, or it's falling and we're also passing through it. The second thing to notice is, as we would expect, during recessions, the output gap goes negative. A little weirdness over here. The third thing to notice is that what we now call the Great Recession, the recession of 2008 and 2009, is actually not quite as bad as it was in 1982. Almost, but not quite as bad. Now, the fourth thing to notice is after most recessions, the economy bounces back very quickly. Right? So here's a recession. Notice that V shape. Another V shape. Another V shape. V. V. All these Vs. Whoa, okay, not so much there, right, after 1990. But even in 2000, a V, not so much here. So the kind of economic recovery that we've had that is not bringing the economy back to potential very quickly is actually quite unusual. It's not unique. It happened again in the early 1990s for very different reasons than what we had happen most recently. But again, that kind of very slow recovery is actually quite unusual. And this has meant, of course, that lots of people have wondered about what's going on in the economy. Has it been because of the government policies we have adopted? Is it because the government policies we shouldn't have adopted, or other policies that we should have, whatever the situation might be? Right? So these kind of unusual situations leave lots of questions open as to exactly what happened. We'll figure all that out before December. Okay, so now a business cycle, what we call a business cycle, is simply the time period between one peak and the next, or between one trough and the next. So it would include a full economic expansion, trough to peak, and a full economic contraction, peak to trough. So the expansion and the contraction put together would give us our complete cycle. The peaks and troughs themselves are referred to as turning points. Duh, right? Nothing magical about that nomenclature. Now, the turning points themselves are determined by a non-governmental organization known as the National Bureau of Economic Research. This is a private organization where mostly academic economists work and do lots of research and publish papers and all sorts of kind of stuff. There is a committee of those economists called the Business Cycle Dating Committee that actually gets together when they need to, when they think that a peak or a trough has been reached, to determine the actual timing. Cal actually has two members of that committee. David Romer and Christina Romer are both members of the Business Cycle Dating Committee. Now, the Business Cycle Dating Committee is never in a rush to actually date peaks and troughs. One reason for that is they don't want to change their minds later. Once they name a peak or a trough, it's pretty much set in stone. So they need to wait a sufficiently long period of time so that they have almost absolute confidence that a peak or a trough has actually been reached. What that means, has meant anyway, is that peaks and troughs are generally announced anywhere from 9 to 24 months after the fact. So if you're running a business or you're making investments and you think that turning points matter for your business decisions or your investment decisions, and you're waiting for the Business Cycle Dating Committee to identify those peaks and troughs, you're out of luck. They're just not going to do it anywhere near the time frame that you are going to be looking at. One other thing, when they do name peaks and troughs, and therefore recessions, and when expansions begin, they are not looking at real GDP. The standard rule of thumb, you'll read about this in the media all the time, is a recession is 2 consecutive quarters where GDP declines. That's a nice rule of thumb. It holds most of the time, but not all of the time. And it's only a rule of thumb. The Business Cycle Dating Committee actually looks at monthly data. The peaks and troughs are identified by month, not by quarter. Remember, real GDP is quarterly data. So they set that aside. Now, if we remember what GDP is, right? It's production. So they look at monthly figures on production. It's expenditures. They look at monthly data on spending. It's income. So they look at monthly data on income. And they also look at monthly data on employment. Right? Our production function says economic output and employment should be positively related. So those 4 monthly data series is what actually they look at in terms of identifying peaks and troughs. Now, when we come to business fluctuations themselves, they do have 5 features. The first is business fluctuations are pervasive. What we mean by that is that they affect most of the country from a geographical perspective, and also most of the industries within the country. So they're not little isolated events that happen in one industry, even if those events might be quite catastrophic. We're looking for broad spread effects. Business fluctuations are recurrent. No matter how much we'd like to get rid of them, they keep coming back, right? They keep coming back. However, although they do come back, they are non-periodic, meaning they come back, but not on a regular time frame or a time schedule. Right? So you can't say, oh, okay, it's 2014, time for a recession. They don't happen every 5 years, every 10 years, every 7 years, whatever you might think. They are also different in magnitude. That means how deep the recession is. From the peak to the trough move is very different between recession activities. Whoops, where's that? So here with this output gap, you can see exactly that. Here are a couple of recessions that had roughly the same troughs, but you can see they're very different from the recessions that we had in the middle and after that. Here's 3 that are very different, 2 that are not so different, but very different from the ones that they're in between. So this is that magnitude difference. So we can't say, oh, we had a really mild recession last time, now we have to have a severe one. Or we had a really severe recession, now we have to have a mild one. It doesn't work that way. The magnitudes of the recessions depend upon what the state of the economy was before the recession began and what caused the recession. What are the factors that caused the recession? Whoops. The last thing that is a feature of business fluctuations is how long they last. Both the expansions and the contractions are very different from one cycle to the next. So this chart simply shows how long business cycle expansions have been since the end of World War II. You can see that the first 4 had an average of only about 36 months. And then we had a really long one, and then we had one in here that was about 4 years, a little less than 4 years. Then we had a really short one. And then the next 3 were actually fairly long. In fact, the longest expansion ever, 10 years in the 1990s. In the current economic expansion is 63 months and counting. And I emphasize counting because it doesn't appear to me that we're in a recession right now. It doesn't, by the way, mean that we're not in a recession. I just don't see any evidence that that's the case. So I think we will go on. One important thing about lengths of economic expansions. Expansions do not die of old age. Right? Expansions do not die of old age. Long expansions can continue for a much longer period of time. Short expansions can die out very quickly. Again, it depends on the initial conditions in the economy and what kind of shocks the economy might endure and what the policy response might be. But simply because we're at 63 months, a year from now we would be at 75. Notice that would make it a quite long economic recovery.